So for this homework, we're going to talk about natural selection. So as you already know or should know, natural selection is very prevalent in the world that we live in, and it's a large cause of evolution. And so we're going to talk a little bit in this video about why and how. And there's some important misconceptions about natural selection that I want to be sure to clear up so that you understand them by the end. All right, so I've come up with an example, and it's a little bit far-fetched, but it's going to illustrate our purpose as well for natural selection. So let's say that in the year 2020, the Earth gets hit by a meteor which moved it several inches closer to the Sun. So go ahead and move it a little bit closer here, and that changes the orbit, as we know, of the Earth. So now we know that the Earth will be rotating much closer to the Sun, and this, would cause all manner of problems, so we're only going to focus on a couple of them. We know that this would be detrimental to human health, and it's going to be detrimental because of increased heat and increased sun exposure, And so we're not going to get into the other issues of things like the damage that might have been caused from the meteor or change in atmosphere. Let's just talk about as if these were the only two changes, was increased heat and increased sun exposure. So over the next century, all the people on the Earth were affected by this increased heat and sun exposure. So I've got 100 people here. Obviously there's more than that on the Earth. I can't fit them all on a screen. But let's just say this represents 100% of the Earth's population. So let's say that after a century, 98% of the Earth population dies as a result of this increased sun exposure. But also, unbeknownst to us, a small percentage of the current population, when they were born, they had some random gene mutation for a resistance to heat and sun exposure. And up until this point in their lives, it didn't really have any positive or negative effect, so that we didn't really notice it. We didn't know about it. So because of this, 98% of the population die, only 2% remain living. So in this depiction, we'll leave 2 people that remain to populate the Earth. You see those 2 people, or that 2%, represented here on this screen as well. So that 2% of population, they're able to live and thrive and reproduce under these new conditions. Despite being closer to the sun, they still are able to survive. And so after many millennia of this 2% of people, reproducing and refilling up the population of Earth, the entire Earth is repopulated. And now all of its inhabitants have the resistance gene to the sun. So the same one that very small amount of people had at the beginning, only 2%, now the entire population of Earth has, because that 2% ended up being the only ones to survive long enough to pass on their genes. So now let's talk about a couple of questions. So the first, how did these people develop a resistance to the sun? So think about that for a minute and pause the video, and then we'll talk about an answer. So you might remember from our explanation before that having this resistance gene was completely random. It developed as a random mutation in DNA, and 2% of the population just happened to have it. So that's how these people had developed that resistance. It wasn't anything that they did, it was just a gene mutation. And that leads us very well into our next question here. So at the time that the meteor hit the Earth, in that year 2020, did this 2% of people, did they already have the resistance gene, or is it something that they developed afterwards, something that they developed after this accident occurred? So once again, pause the video and think about that. So you should have been able to conclude that yes, this resistance gene was already there. It was already in the population before this catastrophic event, and most likely it occurred before the person was even born. It occurred as they were, being created, and like we mentioned, it didn't serve much of a purpose before this event, so it just really wasn't noticed. So the next important question to talk about is this: did the increased exposure to the sun, did it cause the people to become resistant? So once again, pause the video, think about that. So hopefully you concluded that the resistance mutation was not caused by more exposure to the sun. Only the people that had the resistance before this accident survived. So that leads us to our last question. is the resistance gene heritable? So once again, pause the video, think about it. So you should have concluded that yes, that it is heritable. We know that because in the story the world was repopulated with a bunch of people who had this resistance gene. So it may seem like as we go over these questions that they seem pretty simple, but the concepts of them is really what's important. It's important to realize that the people didn't just decide to become resistant. Individuals don't just evolve and become resistant. Resistance is caused by random DNA mutation, and it's got nothing to do with the will of these people or the event that took place. It was a random event that led to a major change in DNA, which was the resistance, and then over the space of hundreds of years, that resistance caused a change in the population. And that change in allele frequency or change in population is the definition of evolution. So it's over a very long period of time as those alleles change. That's the very important thing to get from natural selection, is that it can be an ultimate cause of that. Natural selection isn't evolution, but it's one of the things that can cause evolution. So that should be enough to help you with this homework. Hopefully you're able to learn some new things and this led to a better understanding. If not, go over it again or talk with your TAs and see if they might be able to help you better understand.